Welcome to the China-MENA newsletter. I'm doing another one of these book talks. I haven't done it for a few months, so it's pretty rusty. Hopefully, it'll go well. I'm very happy today to be talking with my old friend, Dr. Andrea Ghiselli. I was thinking about this before we got on Zoom. I've known you for almost a decade now, which seems hard to.
Yes, a while.
Good. How are you doing, Andrea?
Very good, very good. Thank you, John, for having me here.
Of course. So, Andrea, for those of you who don't know, although I'm sure many of you do, Andrea is a lecturer at the University of Exeter. He's recently moved to the UK after a long time at Fudan University in China. He's also the head of research for the China Med Project, which I'm sure many of you follow, subscribe to on Substack. If you don't, I'm putting a link on the page. It's an excellent resource for people who are tracking what China's doing in the Med and the broader Middle East. Absolutely essential reading. So anyway, Andrea is also the author of an excellent book, which I was thinking in my head a recent book, and then I looked at it. This book came out, what, 3 or 4 years ago?
2021, I believe.
21. It's called Protecting China's Interests Overseas, Securitization and Foreign Policy. It's a great book. It's with Oxford University Press. I'm also putting a link to this on the page. It got reviewed everywhere. It got great endorsements. It's a fantastic book. So first, Andrea, congratulations on an excellent book. Can you just give us just the really quick snapshot? What is it you're trying to do with this book? Why did you write it? What are the big takeaways?
Of course. So first of all, thank you a lot, Jonathan, again for the kind invitation and to talk again about my book. It has been a while, and so I'm always happy to talk about my kind of PhD baby.
Right.
So what I try to do, essentially, I've always been interested in Chinese foreign and defense policy, but I thought I'm Italian and I started this project as my PhD. And so it was just after the Arab Spring. And I thought, how do events that are taking place intersect with my interest in Chinese foreign policy? And so especially right, there was the evacuation from Libya, 36,000 people being evacuated almost overnight from there. The PLA was involved, at least from in a more kind of partly operational way, but mostly as showing China's capability to project power and protect citizens abroad. And I thought this is a very interesting topic. How do the Chinese think about it? What's the thinking? What are the changes that are taking place? What are the systems and solutions they're thinking about from, of course, consular protection to the role of the military? And so what I try to do in this book is to understand how different actors in the Chinese polity have been thinking and talking about this problem and these solutions. I particularly focus on, of course, top policymakers, so how they've been defining China's national interest and overseas interest, understood as citizens and companies abroad, in their narrative and policy documents, right? And then try to do the same, looking at how the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has been talking about the same stuff, assuming that there might be differences, which indeed appeared. And then, of course, also the role of experts, which feed information and help policymakers to understand what's going on. And then finally, public opinion. And essentially look at how these different debates influenced each other, and then they've been translated into policies, regulations, and then changes also in China thinking about the military. Long story short, what comes up is a story in which up to the Arab Spring, which was increasingly, the more I think about it, was such a pivotal moment, not really just for the region, of course, but really also for China in so many ways, foreign policy, but also domestically. But I guess we can talk about that later or in another moment. Really up until 2011, the Middle East and North Africa were places that were really outside the radar of Chinese policymakers. Not many people really talking or doing research about that or thinking about it in policy terms. The PLA was not really interested in talking about intervening in faraway regions. Of course, peacekeeping could be done, but peacekeeping is a marginal activity in many ways. It doesn't involve many people. Yeah, there was the piracy mission in Gulf of Aden, it's still there, but somewhat marginal. And so what I found, and this was really one thing that made it so interesting, even for me to do this research, was this gap between what civilians, policymakers, especially on the Hu Jintao and the PLA, thought about this problem. There was a clear gap. Policymakers wanted the PLA to think about it, and thinking more globally, the PLA was not that interested in that. This, at least what is what open source suggests. Arab Spring takes place, big shock. What's going on? What should we do? And this is where really there was a change overnight, with the PLA really starting to take things seriously. And this is where changes really started to take place, both in the improvement and of the Chinese consular protection system, so embassies abroad, for example, but also really also in the PLA, new institutions, new regulations to allow the PLA to think globally. One of the key findings, and it's one of the most interesting things, I think, was that already in 2000, I think it was 2012, 2013, there was an article published in China Military Science, which is the most influential, most authoritative open source military affair journal in China. The head of the now, I believe, it's been absorbed in some of the new offices of the Central Military Commission. In any case, the head of the logistic department back then of the PLA saying we need bases. This was in 2013. And when someone like him writes something like this, it means the decisions was made. And the needs like, Djibouti, that's what was that. So, I think back after Libya, a lot of us outside were thinking, will the Chinese have bases and so on? And apparently they had decided much before. When we started talking about this, they already decided, really. So yeah, so the book is really talks about that, and how things have changed and how Chinese military presence has changed and how the PLA started to prepare. Along with that, I talk about a bit the history of Chinese diplomatic corps, its relations with the scholarly community in China, those who work on the Middle East, our colleagues essentially, and the role of the public opinion with that. And so yeah, and so a long story in a way, it was a big journey for me also to understand how the China thinks about its foreign policy, its military, and the real focus is the Middle East because that's where the story started.
Right.
And so I think still today informs my scholarship on the Middle East.
Yeah, so I think it's great. I mean, one thing for me that's interesting is, I mean, there's a lot, and a lot of things you said that make me think about questions I want to follow up with. But, this is to me, first and foremost, it's a book about Chinese foreign policy and how it's made. And the Middle East is the case. And it's interesting because, for people who are Middle East specialists, they need to understand how China thinks about this stuff. So it's very useful that way. Um, I think there's on the other hand, just looking at there's so much talk about what China is in the Middle East these days. A lot of it is hyperbolic. A lot of it is uninformed. A lot of it kind of goes in very strange directions, assuming China's going to play this massive role here.
Yes.
I often think about our mutual friend Andrew Scobell, who kind of
Hmm.
priority, concentric circles of Chinese foreign policy
Yes.
and it puts the Middle East at or near the bottom, saying, it's not really that important to China. So, what is it other than that Arab Spring era urgency that made you think that this is worth focusing on rather than, say, the South China Sea or
Yes.
another region?
So I have to say again, exactly because the Middle East, I still like to call again. There's been an expansion and diversification of Chinese interest in the region, energy, of course, but so many other things. Um, I still think about the Middle East when people ask me, "How do you think China think about the Middle East?" I say, I think China look at it as the most important among the least important regions. There is so much going on there that should deserve the attention of Chinese policymakers. But the truth is, there's also so much that's going on closer at home for
Yeah.
them. And so I think, when I finished writing the book, I've always been very cautious in not saying so, in saying, okay, the PLA will really start to play a big role in Chinese foreign policy. But in a way, I was prepared for that happening, and that it didn't happen. And I think one of the reasons for this is, of course, we all make mistakes. And luckily, I didn't write that for sure it was going to expand its presence in the region. But I think one of the reasons of this change is also because, again, the region is important, but there's so many other priorities. And expanding military presence there, it's so costly. and it produced so many sunken costs and liabilities, really. And so even when we saw this surge of attention for the region in military terms, it quickly shamed, it quickly decreased. What does not change, of course, is the interest. There's been an enormous investment in China in area studies, especially Middle East studies. I think about Sundegan, Zhang Chu, other friends at Fudan, and so on. And so, but I thought, if something like this, originally the focus on the Middle East was simply because if we have to think about how China might start acting, might form its own more global policy about protecting its citizens overseas, the Royal Military, then the Middle East is where it started. Well, events there will have a significant effect on how China also does the same in different regions, of course. Yeah.
You just mentioned more common or mutual friends, Jiang Tutu and Sun Degang, who I think are among the best Chinese scholars
Yes.
in the Middle East, bar none. They do amazing work. Um, and you worked with them at Fudan, which has developed a really great Middle East studies program.
Yes.
So you've been working with a lot of super impressive people in Chinese IR, foreign policy analysis, Middle East studies. What's your takeaway? What is the state of Middle East studies or area studies in China, knowledge production about the Middle East? Because I think
Yes.
that's another thing that gets exaggerated. In my thinking from being here, I think it's still at a pretty nascent level. But you were actually there working with these guys. What
Yes. My understanding, and maybe later on Chuchu will write to me if she watches this, say, oh, no, you're wrong. But my understanding of this is that it's a small but expanding community. There has really been a lot of investment, not just Middle East, but area studies in general. A lot of programs have appeared. In a way, you can say that Chinese universities and would say the foreign policy complex in China, which of course includes the government, has always been really geared to serve policy and to adapt to the needs of the government. And indeed, some universities like Sisu in Shanghai, but others as well, were born really as factories for future diplomats, pretty much. So there is a tradition, but at the same time, again, with the Middle East being suddenly or again important but not important. Only now I think we start to well, it started years ago this investment, and I think like just anecdotal, of course. But my impression is that there have been improvement, especially a lot of investment in linguistic skills, which maybe were the easier to develop, again, because of the tradition of Chinese academia and Chinese policymaking, which has always paid a lot of attention to languages, right? We talked about translator ambassadors as part of the history of the MFA in China. And so there's capability to build that. Like many other places, I remember a lot of the complaints have always been like, okay, we have people who speak, let's say, Arabic or Farsi or Turkish, but do not know the language, or so do not know the politics or the economy. We know people who do politics but do not speak the language. And so and I think this is not just Chinese academia, right? This is the perennial dilemma of of IR and area studies. So I think the focus has really been in bridging that gap. And so I think if I think about when I wrote this book and today, my impression is that there's been progresses, but of course, everyone could say there's always more to be done. I believe it still remains a relatively small community. There are some very senior figures, like we mentioned Sundegan, you can mention Yu Xinchun, Wu Bingbing, and so on. There are also up and coming new people, Chan Chuchu being one of them. Others in Tsinghua are the same. So there is that group of people. But of course, the Middle East is big, right? You can be an expert on Iran, but if you ask you, what about Algeria? I don't know. Like there's always this bit overstretch. I know this is common for people that study Africa. Like Africa is big. If the government asks a specific question about, let's say, Sudan, either you're a Sudanese expert or not. And so there's always this mismatch, you can say, between demand and offer. But another big problem that I remember being mentioned also, it was, for example, the reliance on Western knowledge, let's say Western textbooks, news, and so on. um, second-hand information. Essentially, they rely on secondary information, a revolving door mechanism that is not as well oiled as it is, let's say, in the United States. We have former diplomats and scholars kind of changing place from time to time. We see that. We see that in China, of course, but it's not that, it's not, doesn't have the same scale. Um, I think there are things that will be changed, that will change, especially this a bit, I believe it's a bit the golden age of Sino-Middle Eastern relations. So if now there's demand and momentum, this is when we'll see the gap closing the fastest. Of course,
Yeah.
let's see in the future, right?
A analogy I often make is that, within America, in the US didn't really see itself as a global actor until the Cold War started. And that's when
Yes,
you saw this explosion in area studies programs and a lot of knowledge production about the rest.
precisely, yes.
And China, you can see the BRI was announced in 2013, and area studies programs start to get a lot more funding, and you start to see a lot better trained scholars coming through the pipeline.
Yes,
And I've noticed a big difference just being based here in the Gulf in seeing the language and communication skills of diplomats, which is where I want to go with you next. Like they're much more effective communicators
yes.
in Arabic, in English. They've got much better trained diplomats. Um, but you've written about this in this book and elsewhere as well, just that, you know, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs isn't the most well-resourced or the most active um,
Yes,
part of government, especially in foreign policy, where you've got all these competing actors, which you do a great job of documenting in the book. And if you are a Middle East, an Arabic language speaker or Farsi speaker or whatever, it's almost like you've reached your terminal point in the ministry.
kinda, yes.
So is this really considered, a prestige post? If you are a Chinese diplomat and you're a Middle East person, do you see a path to career progression that's going to really take you to the upper hall?
If you asked me this when I published the book, I would have said no. Honestly, today, I would say there's a chance. But I'm thinking especially, right, one of the effects of Xi Jinping was this greater ambition, right? One of the books edited by Andrew Scober, right, in which there's a chapter on Iran, JCPOA, right? China became so active in JCPOA because Xi Jinping needed a place where to show its foreign policy ambition. And I think this will also be the story of China's approach to the Middle East today. The Middle East is a place where if you're ambition, you want to show your great power, that's where you should be. And so I think maybe today things have been changed. Maybe now, before we had a very skilled and expert group of diplomats that, however, were not really part of, again, the department that really matter if you want to be promoted, which usually were, let's say, East Asian Affairs Department or the North American Affairs Department. Um, but now with this renewed interest really in the region, I think that there is a space, and this is a new interest because, and so you have both a skilled group of people, but also the political momentum in China to pay attention to it. So who knows? Maybe yes. If you do well in there, you probably have better chances of promotion, right? Think about just guessing, right? For those who worked on the, let's say, discussion of the renormalization of the relation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Maybe, this is something that Xi Jinping was most likely being involved. This can be a great opportunity to rise. So I think with greater interest from the top leadership in playing some sort of role in the region, there's naturally also more space for entrepreneurial and ambitious diplomats to rise through the ranks.
Sure. Okay, well, that brings me, I guess, to the question when you were talking about the Arab Spring as a trigger moment, where this region that previously had been a place to do business or get energy is actually affecting China's domestic political environment, the threat,
Yes,
the spread of you know, um, revolutionary ideas, of course, is a problem
yes,
with governments. Um, what I'm thinking about a lot these days is Syria, and I know you've thought about it a lot. You've written about
yes,
Mohammed al-Saderi. Um, we keep seeing a lot of statements from Chinese leaders about their concern with the direction Syria is going and having foreign fighters, especially Uyghur fighters in the new government
yes,
military. This actually is very interesting to me as a China watcher because you can see once again where events in the Middle East could impact the domestic political situation within China.
Yes.
Are you thinking about this very much, about the implications of Syria's revolution for China's approach to the region?
May I think not to the same extent. I think that the Arab Spring was as influential. I mean, it was very different phenomenon, right? As you said, the Arab Spring had that impact on Chinese citizens in the region. It had that impact on Chinese economic presence, the spread of revolution. There were the Jasmine movement, right? Is what people talked about in China. I think that so there was a huge impact, really, and plus of course, a change of priorities in government in the region, more aligned with the Chinese one. So really huge impact on Chinese politics, Chinese foreign policy, China's approach to the Middle East. When it comes to Syria, I think when the Assad regime collapsed, and I saw some of the initial statements coming from Syria and the Syrian ambassador in Beijing. I thought the Syrians are very skilled. They're saying all the right things. They're not blaming China for anything before. They talk about modernization, economic development, all the right words. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be easy for China. They will have a kind of Afghanistan 2.0 kind of approach, right? As long as you say the right things, you don't bother us. We just be friends, and who knows? We will not give you much money because Syria is still Syria. At the end of the day, still destroyed, and there's not much for China. But still, on this equity ratio, again, I was reading, yeah, the other day or this one, to remember your Substack, right? There was the spokesperson of the MFA saying, well, we're not ready to change our position on sanctions on the Syrian HTS, right? I think this is what they said. And I think they're still kind of trying to figure out, but I don't see it as a gigantic challenge because after all, look, I think Syria or the Uyghurs in Syria are kind of in a box in the sense that there's Turkey in the north. And I think the Chinese have reached a quite clear understanding with Turkey about the Uyghurs. Other countries in the region, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on, they also have other priorities. There's been a change, right? We talk about the fight between secular forces and in many forms, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the change of balance in the priority, right? You have a moderate shift in Saudi and so on. So, and we have evidence, and actually I have a list of cooperation between China and all these countries in monitoring, capturing the Uyghurs. So I don't think, like, of course, the Chinese would prefer to see the Uyghurs kicked out, but I think it's a pretty safe situation. They can wait and see easily. I mean, it just started. You know, the Chinese Syrian leadership might change their position. And the Chinese can wait. In any case, the Gaza and the Palestinian issue is the real thing. And so, you know, I don't think it has the same kind of impact. It might generate some concerns, but I don't think it has the same kind of urgency that many people think, oh, just because they're Uyghurs, oh my God, the people in between are freaking. I doubt.
Right. I think that's fair. I also do think, though, that this shift in Syria really is going to be one of those pivotal moments in Middle East order that we're going to be thinking about
Absolutely.
for a very long
Yeah,
time.
yeah. So let me correct. I'm still thinking mostly about the Uyghurs. I think, yeah, I agree with you, especially in the case of Iran. I think that's really where the people, it's not really about what's going on now in Syria, but the change that happened. I think that's really the key thing that might be keeping people awake, or
Yeah,
some
yeah.
people in Beijing.
I mean, the list of things that's keeping people awake right now is pretty substantial.
Yes.
It's actually at the point right now where I just got off a call before we started this, and I was saying I don't really feel as much point in me writing much right now because it seems that things change so quickly that
Yes.
we just need to all agree to just kind of pause for a while and see how things shake out.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Andrea, thanks so much for this. I think this book, I hadn't pulled it off the shelf until recently. I started looking at it again. I really think that, for people watching this who are Middle East first people, this is really useful because you're going to understand how China, how its foreign policy works and what its priorities are, and it will give you a much clearer idea of how it operates. And for China people, you'll get a better sense of how the Middle East features and China's broader global ambition. it really is a fantastic contribution. I think it's going to be something that we're going to be using for quite a while. So again,
Thank you so
congrats
much.
on a great book, man.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind words. Really
Yeah, yeah,
appreciate it.
thanks. And look forward to chatting again soon.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.